What is included and excluded when calculating remuneration and wages? This is stuff employers should know.
Welcome to Stuff Employers Should Know, proudly brought to you by LabourNet, management's ultimate HR solution.
Hey, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Barry Gordon-Davis, and over there is Yasser, yes like it, Ismail, joining me as always and keeping his fingers on the button. Today is the maths edition of Stuff Employers Should Know. We're going to be discussing the calculation of remuneration and wages. So how are you doing, Yas?
Well, considering the last time I ate was 4 a.m. this morning, not that great, but I guess it is what it is.
So Yas is busy fasting at the moment, and that obviously messes with my lunch plans. I was busy saying to him that for somebody that has eaten so long ago, he's very, very much well in good spirits and stuff. So thank you, and all the best with that.
We always put stuff employers should know first. So
that's it. I was also saying that we're sitting now, I think at the time that this podcast will air, we will be sitting at probably around about 5 or 6 days into not having a lockdown. You're usually saying this is day 750 of lockdown. Now we're finally going into the countdown of, like a NASA launch when it's T-minus. We're now in the plus phase where it's like now post-lifting of that, the state of disaster. But we obviously still have regulations, so that's not saying that everybody can now just run amok. But still, just 1 or 2 days in, and I came to studio and I realized I left my mask at home.
That awkward moment.
But luckily, so I sent Yas out to the studio to go find me a mask, and he came back with what looked like a pair of old underwear and claims that that's his spare one from his car, which I'm using, and I don't know, I think he found it outside somewhere.
So when I said spare one from my car, I meant spare one underneath my car.
But anyway, getting into today's topic. So calculation of remuneration and wages. Now, we're going to give a whole bunch of different equations that get used with it. And this is just the simple ones that get asked of us quite often. And we've been getting a couple of emails saying, listen, just run something on how do we calculate this and how do we calculate that. And there's a standard set of calculations that you can use. So obviously, it's based on the amount of ordinary hours worked by the employee. So if we want to look at and calculate, let's say, the monthly rate, daily rate, weekly rate, it's used on ordinary hours because it's obviously, you shouldn't be able to predict a overtime, where overtime should not be worked as a ordinary hour. Overtime should be in a event that we require overtime. So that's not necessarily taken into account. So when we look at calculating our remuneration and wages, firstly, let's talk about how do we then get to a monthly amount. So let's get into today's topic, and the use of calculating weekly or daily or monthly wages is obviously has many uses, particularly when wanting to, let's say, pay out a leave or pay out any amount that is due to an employee and a specific rate needs to get determined.
Okay, so this being the math edition, let's talk about some calculations.
Yes.
So for example, if you are an employee who knows their hourly rate, daily rate, or weekly rate, how would you then go about calculating what you'd earn for that month?
Yeah, 100%. So scaling from the daily rate to the monthly rate, or from the monthly rate down to the daily rate, it's the same calculations, obviously just using either multiplication or division. So when you want to determine how many, let's say your weekly rate, if you want to turn your weekly rate into a monthly rate, that is then a multiplication by 4.33. So you multiply your weekly rate by 4.33 to get a monthly rate. Or if you want to determine your weekly rate, you divide your monthly rate by 4.33 to get your weekly rate. And then your weekly rate you can turn into a daily rate, obviously by dividing it or multiplying it, depending on which way you're working it, as to the number of days in that week that you ordinarily work.
Okay, so obviously if you work 5 days a week, it would be divided by 5. So you take your weekly rate divided by 5, and that gives you your daily rate.
100%.
All right, perfect.
And finally, to work out one's hourly rate, that would obviously then use the daily rate divided by the ordinary amount of hours, or as defined in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, for the purposes of calculating wage, the employee is deemed to ordinarily work 45 hours in a week or 9 hours in a day. And you can use those calculations unless the employee works less than that per week or less than that per day.
Okay, that's pretty simple math, Barry. On to my next question. What about employees that are commission earners or have payment that fluctuates every month? How do we calculate what they'd earn?
Yeah, and it's quite important because, the question always arises, I've got an employee that is a commission-based earner and their remuneration every month fluctuates significantly. How do I pay them when they, let's say, go on leave, for example, or take their annual leave? What you got to do is then determine what their earnings are by using their remuneration or their earnings in the preceding 13 weeks. You use an average of that to then use those same calculations and work out what their hourly, daily, or weekly rate would be, depending on what's applicable.
Okay, that's actually pretty simple. I was expecting a hectic calculation and a few formulas being thrown at me.
So you find a lot of guys that are significant commission earners put in a lot of hard work in just before they go on leave because they know that preceding 13 weeks will be part of what they would then be entitled to. And the same thing would go when it comes to notice periods as well. So we need to understand that working out a notice, if notice is paid out in lieu of it actually being worked, how much would they actually then be getting?
All right. So for commission earners and normal employees, obviously the notice period calculation would differ.
Well, as I say, it depends on when it's worked or not. So a commission earner who works out their notice would then be due what they would normally ordinarily earn, and that would be based on their sales. But a lot of times there's situations where there might be an agreement that a salesperson might leave and be paid out an amount equal to what they would have ordinarily received. So how do we determine what they ordinarily would have received? And that's that calculation of using the average of the preceding 13 weeks.
Okay, cool. Perfect. Okay, moving on to payslips. I know we've had issues before.
Remember what happened the last time you whipped out your payslip?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, you stormed out of here. But I'll just have the listeners know that we have resolved our issues and we're all on board.
You mean that income differential of I'm trying to figure out why you earn so much, huh?
Barry, I gave you some Turkish delight. Let's not get into it.
Oh, yes, I did get my Turkish delight. Cool. I'm not complaining.
Okay, so payslips. Most payslips have many line items, obviously, as you would know. So what exactly is included and what's excluded from these payslips?
Okay, so when we want to determine what's included, and I mean, this is obviously for payments such as a severance pay or notice pay or even leave pay, there's the Basic Conditions of Employment Act guides us, or there's actually a government gazette that helps us with severance pay. But talking about for the payment of those, what is included in remuneration is the cash value of any payment in kind that forms part of the employee's remuneration, but excludes gratuities, allowances paid to the employee for the purposes of enabling an employee to work, or any discretionary payments that are not related to the employee's hours of work or work performance. But we also then are guided by it's actually a government gazette that then guides us as to what's included and excluded, specifically when working out severance in terms of Section 41 of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. So what is included? Housing or accommodation allowances or subsidies, or the actual housing or accommodation received as a benefit in kind, car allowances, any cash payments made to the employee, except obviously those excluded in terms of the schedule, any other payment in kind, except those as per the schedule, employers' contributions to medical aids, pensions, provident funds, and similar schemes, as well as funeral or death benefit schemes are all included. So what is excluded is any cash payment or payment in kind that is there to enable the employee to work. So, for example, equipment, tools, or an allowance, for the provision of transport that enables the employee to travel to and from work, for example. A relocation allowance is excluded. Other gratuities such as tips from customers or gifts from employers, share incentive schemes, discretionary payments that are not related to the employee's hours of work. So let's say a discretionary profit sharing scheme would be excluded. Entertainment allowances, and then education and schooling fees are also excluded.
Okay, that's a long list of exclusions.
Yeah, so the best thing to do is obviously just check in with your consultant and just make sure, because I know this is how it's listed in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, or it's appropriate schedules or gazettes. However, we might call them different things, and employers like to call things different things. We just need to see whether it falls within the definition of the BCEA.
Awesome. Thanks for that information, Barry, and thanks for the maths edition. It made me feel like I was back in matric and watching SABC and getting a on set maths lesson there.
Yes, I unfortunately don't have the projector or all the highlighters and dry board markers on my hands. So it looks a little bit different than that. And I think that we're doing pretty basic maths. I think that's why I do law rather than maths.
100%.
As Jas said, that's it for the maths edition of Stuff Employers Should Know. If you found today's episode helpful, or any of our previous episodes helpful for that matter, please go and like those episodes. Like this episode, rate us. It really does help the podcast. And if you want to get in touch, drop us a mail at sesk@labournet.com or on any of the social media platforms. So going into the uplifted no state of disaster. Still, I'll say, stay safe out there. COVID's still a reality. And till the next episode, from myself and Jas, cheers.
Stuff Employers Should Know was proudly brought to you by LabourNet, management's ultimate HR solution. For more episodes from Stuff Employers Should Know, go to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you play your favorite shows. Case law or statutes referenced in the podcast are current at the time of recording.